Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be getting started here in just a few minutes. Just still waiting on some folks to join up in the class, but we'll get started at the regular time of 7:40. All right, well, it is 7:40, so we're going to get started today with the world history class. So I was gone on Thursday and Friday out of town, but you guys did have some assignments to do during that time. Those assignments, if you noticed, were due yesterday. That should have given you plenty of time to complete them. If you have not yet submitted those assignments, please do so as soon as possible so that I can get those entered into the grade book. Remember that even if it is late, you still can get 80% credit on them. There's a handful of students I sent emails to yesterday who have not been handing in work, which means that very quickly your grade has precipitously fallen to the F level. So if that's you, please make sure that you're staying on top of those things that you need to do in order to stay in good standing with your grades. Although I was gone, There is some things that I would like to lecture on and talk about today pertaining to ancient Rome, as well as the Judeo-Christian monotheistic religion stuff. These were the topics that were covered on Thursday and Friday of last week. I had posted some videos for you about the ancient Rome part of things. Hopefully you watch those, give you a little bit more complete picture of how ancient Rome fits into what we're talking about. Remember that we're really more focused in this class about the Roman Republic era rather than the Roman Empire era. But nonetheless, we are going to talk a little bit more about these things while I have you on a live lecture, so that I can say that I did my due diligence in talking about these things. So let's start with, I'm on slide, if you want to pull up the PowerPoint, good morning to you. Hello, thank you so much for saying good morning in the chat. I'm on slide 30 of the PowerPoint. If you want to get the PowerPoint going again, we're still on the Unit 1 PowerPoint. And so I'm just going to take some time. I am going to go through this a little bit more quickly because this is stuff now that you should already have been exposed to. For Friday's lesson, there was a short reading assignment. I think there was like 4 pages or something to read. That's really pretty doable on the monotheistic religions. But again, I just want to take time today to talk about these things. So slide 30 of the Unit 1 PowerPoint, and here we go. So while Greece is in decline, Rome is really very much developing as a civilization, and it lasts a long time. They sometimes call it the Roman millennium because it lasts for about 1,000 years. From 1000 BC to 500 BC, so this is kind of almost pre-Greek Empire, early Romans fought the Greeks and Etruscans for the Italian peninsula. And in 600 BC, basically Rome starts off as kind of a monarchy. Kings ruled Rome until a group of aristocrats overthrew the king and set up a government called a republic. And this is where we get the name of senators, right? Senators are these aristocratic noble figures who became statesmen in the Roman Republic. You can see where Rome is on the next slide there on slide 31. That's on the Italian peninsula. Rome is of course, capital of modern day Italy. At the time, Italy was not a unified state or anything like that. It was kind of a collection of smaller places. But the Roman Empire ends up establishing dominance not only in Italy, but across much of Europe and even into North Africa and the Middle East. And Rome is right kind of smack in the middle there of the west coast of the Italian peninsula. You can often identify Italy on a map because it looks like a giant kind of heeled boot kicking out into the Mediterranean Sea. A republic is a form of government where power is given to the citizens to vote, but this time, instead of like in the Athenian democracy in Greece, where they were voting directly on laws, in Rome they're voting for representatives, and so the power is given to the citizens who have the right to elect the leaders who will make governmental decisions. And this probably sounds somewhat similar to the notion of what Plato was talking about in the Republic with that idea of philosopher kings. Philosopher kings were supposed to be the wisest, not just simply the richest people running society. And you wanted to have people who were educated statesmen who made good decisions and worked with one another to make these decisions. You did not want simply a tyrant in power. And so this is considered an indirect form of democracy because we're not voting directly on the laws that are being passed. Rather, what we're doing is we're voting on representatives who know more about lawmaking, who know about the needs and concerns of the people in order to create laws that benefit society. In modern day times, we utilize the Republican style of government here. And when I say that, I'm not talking about the Republican Party. Okay, the Republican Party is just a name. The Democratic Party is just a name. That's just what they call themselves. Okay, we live in a Republican, small r Republican government where we vote for representatives. That's all that means. And the representatives that we vote for, we hope, have knowledge about the laws and knowledge about the needs of society and will make decisions that benefit the people. But it's indirect, right? And we wouldn't really well function with a direct democracy here in the United States. And I think I mentioned this in a previous lecture, but keep in mind that some of these bills that get passed by our legislative branch, Congress, could be thousands of pages long. People don't have the time in their everyday work lives to be sitting down and reading a 1,000-page bill to see if they should vote on it. Not to mention, most people probably don't have the level of education necessary to be able to really even understand the law. These laws are extraordinarily complex. They use unusual verbiage that's exclusive to it's jargon that lawyers use and things like that. So the laws are not easy necessarily to understand, and I would actually be surprised if even a lot of senators read every word of the bills that they passed. They have teams of people that they use to delegate work out to others so that they can figure out different parts of the law and be informed about it. So it's just not a practical decision to have America be a direct democracy. People barely show up every 4 years to vote for the president. You couldn't even imagine how little participation we would get if we were having people show up multiple times a month, maybe several times a week, to vote on laws that really they didn't even understand. Not to mention, you'd probably get a lot of really wacky laws passed because the only people who would end up showing up for it would be the people that were either really, really for it or really, really against it. Most people really wouldn't even know what was going on. So direct democracy really wouldn't work in the United States. So instead, we kind of took a page out of the Romans book when the Romans established their republic, where they had senators making laws and making decisions. So only free-born male citizens were able to vote in Rome. Obviously, our democracy is a little bit more widespread than that. And we talked, you should have learned about last week on Thursday. Sorry, my lights are turning off here. Come on. This is so annoying. Hello. It's one of those days. All right. There's two groups of people that are struggling for power in Rome, patricians and plebeians. Your plebeians are going to be kind of your common farmers, artisans. Remember, an artisan's not really an artist. An artisan makes like crafts and things like that. Merchants sell them. And citizens, they were citizens with voting rights, but they were barred from actually holding governmental positions themselves. Whereas the patricians pretty much inherited most of their power and their social status. One of the important developments, and I'm now on slide 34 of the Unit 1 PowerPoint if you're following along with me. One of the important developments of the Roman Republic was something called the 12 Tables. The 12 Tables was an important victory for the plebeians because it forced laws to be written down. Throughout much of European history, and really history in a lot of places, because laws weren't written down, this left them very much open to local interpretation, and the laws would be carried out in different ways. And today here in the United States, obviously laws are written down, and the punishments for those laws are well known. And here in the United States, it's supposed to be the case where you have kind of equal punishments for equal crimes. That is to say that if somebody gets caught stealing, one person isn't going to be put to death for it and another person be let go with a slap on the wrist or something. The penalties for breaking the law here in the United States are based on common law. It's supposed to be the case where, the punishments for laws are relatively even, and they're based on the degree of the crime. So more severe crimes against people are punished more severely, and less severe crimes are punished less severely. In ancient Rome, and indeed in a lot of places in Europe, throughout much of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, which we're going to be talking about a little bit later, laws were carried out very haphazardly. And a person with a lot of money or a lot of wealth or a lot of influence might be able to get away with certain crimes with a relatively light punishment, and then other folks may not be able to. And of course, the likelihood that your punishment was more severe increased the poorer that you were. So this was an important victory for the plebeians because it let them know what the laws were. And having the laws written down meant that the laws can't just be interpreted unfairly as easily anymore, because the laws are in plain sight for everyone to see. So that's what the 12 tables were. The laws were written down literally on 12 tablets and put on display in public in 451 BC. Romans had government with separate branches of government, just like the Athenians did and just like we do. So we have a legislative branch, which is Congress. That's the lawmaking body. We have the judicial branch. The judicial branch is like the court system, the criminal justice system that interprets disputes about the laws in case there's any constitutional amendments being broken, for example. And then we have the executive branch, which is the carrying out of the laws. So they had in Rome, kind of similar, they had the consuls, which is kind of like the executive branch, two officials that directed the army and government. That's essentially the role of the president. And they served 1-year terms. They had a legislative branch, which was a senate made up of patricians in Roman society who controlled the foreign and financial policies and made laws. And they had 2 assemblies of other citizens who would help to inform the Senate. And Rome expanded greatly over the next several hundred years by conquering various territories. I'm now on slide 36 of the PowerPoint. But in 27 BC, Rome no longer was a republic, and it became ruled by an emperor. And you may have listened to the videos that I sent you in the announcement on Thursday morning. And that was the rise of Julius Caesar, who ultimately was assassinated. And the empire became so large, it was really difficult to apply Roman law evenly, because the larger the empire got, the farther away you were from Rome, the more difficult it was to administer the law in an even, fair way. The Roman laws were supposed to be based on reason, supposed to be based on justice. They were meant to protect citizens and their property. And citizens of Rome had certain privileges that subjects of Rome didn't have. There is a difference between a citizen of Rome and a subject of Rome. So, for example, talking about the monotheistic religions, by the time that Jesus comes around, right around the year 0, roughly, basically the territory that Jesus lived in was a territory called Judea. And Judea was a Roman principality. It was controlled by the Roman Empire, but the subjects that lived there were not Roman citizens. They were subject to the laws of Rome, but they were not afforded the same kinds of rights and privileges that citizens of Rome got. They were simply expected to follow the rules of the Roman Empire as they had been subdued, conquered by Rome, and they are now subject to Roman laws, though they are not themselves citizens of Rome. So that is an important distinction to make. Roman law, I'm on 37 now, Roman law influences many democracies today. The idea with Roman citizens is that Roman citizens all had equal treatment under the law. They were considered innocent before proven guilty. That's a big one. That's something that we have in our own criminal justice system as well, because imagine if you were presumed guilty and had to prove your innocence. Well, that would be really difficult to do, because if you're presumed guilty, probably you're already behind bars. So the effort that you would need to exert to prove your innocence would be quite a burden to uphold. Here in the United States and in most democracies around the world, when you were accused of a crime, you were accused by your accuser, but the burden of proof rests with whoever accuses you of the crime, not with the person who has been accused of the crime. So it's up to, if somebody was to steal something from my classroom, it would be up to me to furnish the proof, the evidence, to substantiate their guilt in that incident. And so when we talk about modern day court proceedings, it is the prosecutor who has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a person actually did commit a crime. So any law that was unfair also could be set aside, and we have that same thing here too with constitutional amendments and things of that nature. So if it is determined that a law or a practice in the United States is unfair, we have a process where we can reform the laws and throw them out and make new ones. So basically, what's the legacy of Rome? They gave the idea of a republic, of a representative democracy, an indirect form of democracy where people vote on wise experts to make laws rather than simply voting directly on laws or resting on a tyrant to make all of the decisions. People are the citizens of the state. That's another major factor here, not the person who rules the state. See, here in the United States, right? And that's a very big proponent of citizenship. A factor of citizenship is that here as a United States citizen, when you go to another place and they say, "Where are you from?" You say, "Well, I'm from the United States. I'm an American citizen." You don't say, "I am a subject of our Lord and King Donald Trump," or something like that. Okay. Your loyalty rests with the state, your loyalty rests with the country, with the nation perhaps, the people of America, the systems of government of America, rather than your loyalty resting with the ruler of that place. And I know that might seem like I'm splitting hairs, but to be honest with you, it's a significant difference. Hello there, good morning everybody. Laws should be written down. Also, that's another thing we take away from Rome. Laws should be written so that they can be made available to everybody. Everybody knows what the laws are. They're written down and they're clear as crystal. That being said, of course, laws are only as good as the language that they're written in. And sometimes the language that is used to write laws can be complex and difficult to understand. And perhaps not, based on a person's educational background, perhaps just having the laws written isn't necessarily enough in some cases, right? So that's another thing that we should probably consider. All right, moving on to the next section. That's just basically a really, really rough overview of what you should have taken away, some of the major points that you should have taken away from the lesson that you guys did on Thursday and the videos that you watched and so on and so forth. Hopefully you have those assignments submitted already. Again, if you do not, please make sure that you do submit those as soon as possible so that I can keep the gradebook updated. All right, moving on to slide 41 of the PowerPoint now. I am going to now take some time to briefly review the other assignment that you had on Friday pertaining to the formation of these three major monotheistic religions. So the idea behind monotheism, of course, is that as opposed to the Roman and Greek religions or mythologies, they were polytheistic. And what that means is that they believed in many gods. And typically in the case of Greece and Rome, these gods were not perfect. They were flawed in some sense, right? They had tragic flaws sometimes. They were spiteful, they were vengeful, they could be, two-faced or backstabbing or whatever. And so monotheism takes a different approach to religion that basically says there's one God, and that God is perfect, that God is all-knowing, that God is infallible, and so on and so on. And the original Abrahamic tradition comes from Judaism. Now, Judaism is much older than Christianity. Christianity starts off actually as a subsidiary, a sect of Judaism. So in the early days of Christianity, actually, they were known as Christian Jews because they followed the teachings of a Jewish prophet by the name of Christ. And so, or otherwise known as Jesus. It wasn't until a little bit later, what was the first religion? Oh gosh, I don't know. That would be tough to say. Probably religions, it depends on how you're defining religion, really, Arnav. That's a pretty complex question. I mean, there are religious traditions that are tens of thousands of years old, like animism and stuff like that, where almost like ancient Native American religions and things like that. These are spiritual belief systems. I don't know if the connotation of religion has changed over time. So, but spiritual beliefs and so on have existed for a long time. The degree to which they were formalized, however, is definitely subjective. But as far as the first Abrahamic tradition, Judaism is the one. And so that's why we focus on this. So Judaism is an Abrahamic tradition that Christianity spawned off of. Remember that Jesus was himself Jewish. He lived in a predominantly Jewish region in the eastern stretches of what was at the time the Roman Empire. And then Islam is another Abrahamic tradition, but Islam doesn't come about until right around the year 600 AD. So but it's about 600 years younger than Christianity is. Of course, keeping in mind that all of these religious traditions are thousands of years old now, and that they've been around for a very long time, they have had quite a degree of influence on the development of society, and that's why we talk about them. I want to make clear to you guys that although we do talk about religion from an academic standpoint in here, I have no vested interest. I'm not a spiritual guide. I am not a priest. I am not any sort of religious figure. I am simply a teacher. So whatever your own personal religious beliefs are, that's great. Keep them, change them, whatever you want to do. That's not of my concern. The thing that is of my concern is that you understand the influence that these monotheistic religions have had over the course of the last several thousand years. So with these new monotheistic religions, we have a new conceptualization of God, of this almighty, powerful being. In Judaism, Yahweh, right? In Christianity, God. In Islam, Allah, okay? Ideas about the responsibilities, worth, and authority of individuals contributed greatly to the development of Western society as we know it. And I would say that in particular in America, which has held on to kind of a religiosity in a way that perhaps other places in Western Europe have kind of moved away from in the last several hundred years, we've seen increasing trends of secularism. Secularism is simply a fancy word for non-religious. All right, so if you are secular, you're non-religious. If you're pious, that might mean you're very religious. But in Europe, for example, in modern day times in Europe, church attendance is really very, very low. There's a lot of folks in Europe that are just not quite very religious, particularly the further north you go, Scandinavia, places like Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, not particularly super religious regions of Europe, but even England, France, places like that. So anyhow, but religion nonetheless does play a significant role for a very, very long time in the Western tradition. And so with Judaism, it came as far back as about 1800 BC from the early Hebrew civilization, which are now called Jews. Jewish folks who live in Israel speak Hebrew, but it's more of a modernized version of Hebrew because Hebrew was an ancient language that fell out of use for a long time, so they had to kind of modernize it to be able to function in modern times. And their beliefs were written down in a holy book known as the Torah. And if you are not Jewish, but you are Christian, you may know the Torah as the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. So as I said, remember, Christianity starts off as a sect of Judaism. So it spawns from Judaism, but then takes on its own identity and its own religious structure maybe about 100 or 2 years after Jesus dies. The idea behind Judaism is that humans were given moral freedom, a choice between good versus evil. And Greeks and Romans had said that people the reason that people had dignity was from their ability to use reason. The Jews kind of took on a different belief. They said, people needed to live moral lives. It's not just about how able you are to use reason. It's about how able you are to choose between good and evil, and that you have a moral responsibility to choose to do good. And so Jews and later on Christians said that people didn't gain dignity from their ability to use reason, which is, of course, a break from the belief of the Roman and the Greek societies, which said that the people who had the most dignity in society were the people who were able to use reason the best, right? And so they're saying, in particular, the Jews say, no, you have dignity just by being a child of God, just by being you, just by being born. Now, remember that the Jewish faith, in the early days of the Jewish faith, people did not convert to Judaism, because Judaism wasn't the kind of religion they're known as universalizing religions. So Christianity became a universalizing religion, and what that was they actively sought converts. They sought to convert people to Christianity, sometimes through force, sometimes through military conquering, other times through peaceful work, building missions and other things like that. So Christians were actively trying to expand the Christian faith and gain converts, people who were adherents to the faith. Jews did not do this in the early days. It was more of a local faith, and the Jews didn't have an interest in spreading their religion in the same way that the Christians eventually did. So the Jewish faith was always relatively local, and it was also very matriarchal, meaning that if your mother was Jewish, the likelihood that you would be Jewish was significantly higher. And so Judaism took on kind of this ethnic component to it that Christianity doesn't really have. See, Christianity being universalizing, anyone of any ethnicity was able very early on to convert to Christianity, but Jewish folks, generally the Jewish faith stayed within Jewish families. And so there was kind of this ethnic component on top of the fact that there was a religious component to it. So if you've ever heard two Jewish folks referred to as a race or as an ethnic group and as a religion, that's why. It's because they were it was matriarchal, it was matrilineal. People Jewish women would marry Jewish men and have Jewish children, and that was that. And there was not a whole lot of people who were born outside of the Jewish faith who would actively convert to Judaism, although that does happen in modern times. People needed to live moral lives according to the Jews, and so the Judeo beliefs emphasized the worth of the individual. Now, Jews had a written code of laws, which of course you're probably familiar with if you practice Christianity, known as the Ten Commandments. 10 Commandments are kind of the basis for the moral structure of the Judeo-Christian Abrahamic faiths. And they're listed on page 13 of the book. There were some questions that you had to answer on some of this stuff. But remember, they focus, again, more on morality and ethics, less on politics. So it's different from the 12 tables. The 12 tables were laws, right, from the Roman Empire that were written down so that everybody would understand the laws and know how they were to be followed and the punishments for them. The 10 Commandments are more about living a moral life. They're about ethical decisions. You shouldn't cheat on your wife. You shouldn't kill people. You shouldn't steal. Those kinds of basic fundamental principles to having a society that functions rather than having it be anarchic and chaotic. But remember that when Judaism and also when Christianity were developed, we were living in a very different historical discourse. And the Old Testament of the Bible was written largely under something called the Hammurabi Code, which was very, very strict, harsh punishments, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth style punishments, which is not how we run our modern day governmental system, right? There are some places that have the death penalty, but for the most part, if stealing, we're not going to chop people's hands off for stealing or something like that anymore. We're not going to throw people in the stockade for public ridicule anymore, right? So laws have changed over time, to be less, or punishments for laws rather, have changed over time to be less fierce, less, less, what's the word that I'm looking for, like barbaric, okay? So in 700 BC, we start to see prophets emerge. So there were stories in the early days of Judaism that a prophet would come and rescue the Jewish people. And so in 700 BC, and throughout all the way up until Jesus's time and even thereafter, there were a whole lot of Jewish self-proclaimed prophets, messengers of God, and so prophets were usually opposed to war. They were opposed to oppression. They were opposed to greed. And Jews believed that everybody should be responsible to kind of do the same, like to denounce unfairness, to denounce war, to denounce oppression. And keep in mind that Jewish folks, being a relatively small group in Europe at that time, were often treated differently because they had different beliefs, and they had they seemingly didn't really fit in with the framework of what a lot of Europeans believed at that time, whether it be polytheistic systems or whatever else. Also, kind of the the selectivity of the Jewish faith, being that really in order to be Jewish, you had to be born Jewish, was seen as elitist by some. And so Jewish folks faced a lot of persecution early on in the day. And, they've suffered a lot of poverty and injustice as a result of that. And so it stands to reason why they would come out very strongly against things like poverty, against things like injustice, against oppression and war and greed and conquering and things. Eventually, Rome took over this far distant region called Judea in about 63 BC, about 60 years before Jesus was born. Jesus, we say, was born roughly in the year 0. He may have been born a few years before that. Remember that documentation and birth records and things like that really didn't exist at that time in that area. And so he was Jewish. He was a subject of Rome, but not a citizen of Rome. And starting at age 30, he began a ministry, and he was a self-proclaimed prophet of the Jewish faith, but his teachings kind of extended past what the traditional Jewish teachings were, and he focused on loving gods, loving your neighbors, loving your enemies, and even loving yourself. And this is the story of Jesus, but eventually, here's the thing that you have to keep in mind. So let's move away from more of the religious aspects of things and talk about Jesus as a political threat. So I'm now on slide 47 of the PowerPoint, if you're following along here. Here's the thing that you have to keep in mind. Rome at this time is in the early days of developing an empire, and it has a vested interest in keeping control in the regions that are the most distant, because those are the regions that are newly acquired territories. They're trying to keep the lid on things. They're trying to assert their dominance in those areas. And the last thing that they want is some sort of, charismatic, leader of sorts, whether he be a religious leader, political figure, or any sort of leader, gaining a following, and then ultimately posing a threat to the stability of those regions that they just conquered. So the Roman Empire has a vested interest in trying to keep the lid on these places and prevent uprisings and discontent from starting to bubble up in those regions. So Jesus is perceived by the local governor of the Roman Empire's region of Judea. His name was Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate has kind of two options to handle this affair. He can either write back to the Caesar, to the Roman emperor, and say, hey, I don't know if you knew this, but we've got this guy named Jesus, and he's got a whole lot of followers, and he seems to really be gaining a whole lot of traction. All right, imagine how the emperor is going to perceive that. Do your job, okay? Your job is to control this region, not to let people gain big followings and potentially maybe start an uprising and overthrow the region or something like that. Pontius Pilate's head would be lobbed off of his shoulders if he lost control of that region. So he has a vested interest too, personally, for keeping his head on his shoulders, to put out any fires before they become uncontainable. So Jesus is put to death in right around the year 2930 by crucifixion. Now, crucifixion was a common Roman style of execution at that time. The way that it works, they put you up on a cross. Jesus was put up on a cross with a couple of other common criminals because that's just how Rome handled things. And it's a pretty brutal form of execution. You're put on the cross, and your arms will be able to hold yourself up for a while until your muscles give out, they'll tear, your body will sag down, and then it'll suffocate you. And so the followers of Jesus say that he rose from the dead. The term Christos means savior, so that's where the term Christ comes about. It's a Greek term. And the Romans were mostly hostile towards Jews and Christians for over a century afterwards. So this is kind of the beginnings of Christianity. Here you have some images of, perhaps what Jesus may have looked like. Probably not the left one. Jesus was probably not this traditionally European-looking guy. If you look at people from the Middle East, they don't look like some guy that just, I don't know what that guy looks like. He kind of looks like a friend that I used to play hockey with. But anyway, he probably looked a little bit more ethnically Middle Eastern rather than European. So we don't really, of course, know exactly what Jesus looked like. It would be really tough to make any determination on that one way or another. Christianity starts to spread, though, across the Roman Empire. And it's because, kind of ironically, actually, because the Romans were trying to stamp out Christianity, right? The story of Jesus was something that could have proved to create instability. Now, the Romans were very, very superstitious folks. And so they believed in multiple gods, and even Constantine, the emperor who made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire several hundred years after Jesus died. Remember that Christianity doesn't become the faith of the Roman Empire until about 360 years after the death of Jesus, and so, or 330 years after. And so it takes a long time for Christianity to really kind of catch on. But after 150 years, it starts spreading much more rapidly because in the process of the Romans trying to stamp out Christianity, what they did was they tried to exile and spread these people apart so that, so that they wouldn't gain a whole lot of traction. But it had the exact opposite effect. By exiling these people and sending all of these Christian Jews to different regions of the Roman Empire, they actually spread their story much faster, and it actually ended up accelerating the spread of Christianity. And this is sometimes known as the Christian diaspora. Most conversions to Christianity are not really complete conversions. Some examples of that would be like, here's the thing about the Romans. The Roman faiths, or the pagan faith of the Roman Empire, where they believed in the Roman gods and so on, the polytheistic pagan faith, had a whole bunch of celebrations of harvest and summer and winter solstices and equinoxes and things like that. Christianity, in the early days of Christianity, was a really, really, really strict lifestyle, and it was not a whole lot of fun. Certainly not like modern churches where people show up and listen to charismatic speakers, and sing and dance and have full bands with drum sets and guitars and stuff like that. That is not at all what early Christianity looked like. It was a very difficult life, and it was a life of not a whole lot of fun. And so you can imagine asking a bunch of Roman people to convert to Christianity was probably going to be a tall order, because it doesn't sound like a lot of fun. And the Romans were used to having a lot of fun with their faith and having celebrations and so on and so forth. And so that's how we see things like Christmas develop. So there used to be a Roman religion called a Roman traditional holiday called Saturnalia, and it happened right around the winter solstice. And so, that was one of the favorite holidays that the Romans celebrated. And when Christianity started to spread, they needed a similar thing to kind of entice Roman peoples to convert to Christianity. And people would say, well, do you celebrate Saturnalia? And the Christians would say, no, we don't, but we do celebrate something that happens to fall right around the same time. in late December called Christmas, and it's similar, and we give gifts and we celebrate the birth of Christ and so on and so forth. And so that's why we don't really know when Jesus was born actually, but we say it happens December 25th. And this is an ancient story that was developed so that Christianity would be able to more easily convert Roman pagans to the faith. So anyhow, it took time to become familiar to Romans. And eventually, by the time that we get to 360, 380 AD, meaning like after well, it doesn't mean after death. AD means Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. But after Jesus dies, 300 years after Jesus dies or so, a lot of Romans practiced kind of both Christianity and a belief in the pagan gods, because again, they're really superstitious. And they're hedging their bet a little bit, right? They're hedging their bet. So even Emperor Constantine, all the way up until his deathbed, still believed in the sun god, Apollo. So anyhow, moving forward, Islam, early 600s, based on the teachings of a different prophet, but again, of the same creation story, the Abrahamic creation story that goes all the way back to Judaism. Allah means God in Arabic. The holy book is called the Quran, and followers of Islam are called Muslims. So they emphasize the dignity of all human beings, a brotherhood of people. Whoops, I accidentally hit the wrong thing here. And the beliefs of Islam, sometimes you don't see it as much these days, but in the early days of me teaching this class, the beliefs of Muslim folks kind of got dragged over the coals in the kind of global terrorist age after 9/11, and there was a lot of xenophobia surrounding Muslim folks and the faith of Islam and so on and so forth. Now that I think we're moving into this whole COVID era, we're kind of moving into a new generation, not to say that the problems of the Middle East have been solved, not by a long shot, but the focus today in 2020 has not been so much on global terrorism or ISIS or any of that sort of thing. So we don't hear as much about it in the news media these days because people are preoccupied with hurricanes, COVID, murder wasps, or whatever those things are called, and all sorts of other things. But we haven't heard as much about global terrorism recently. But in a few years ago, as recent as a year or two ago, there was a whole lot of stories about, Syria and ISIS and Afghanistan and so on. And of course, fears of global terrorism stoked xenophobia in the United States, where people have been perhaps a little bit more critical of the Muslims across the world. But the fact of the matter is that most Muslims, the vast majority of Muslim folks, just like the vast majority of Christians, are just regular human beings trying to get along and get by, and are perfectly good people. And so offering charity to help those in need, showing tolerance for Jewish and Christian practices, particularly in the early days of the Ottoman Empire. Remember that the Muslims conquered much of the Middle East and North Africa, and really were the ones to preserve a lot of the ancient Greco-Roman art, architecture, literature, and all of that, and trade it back to the Italians in the Renaissance. So, for 1,000 years, it was really the Muslims who practiced a far more tolerant version of monotheism than the Christians did. The Christians really went out of their way to attempt to destroy the remnants of the Roman Empire and establish a uniform doctrine of Catholicism, which was the original faith of Christianity, was just the Roman Catholic Church. There were no other subsidiaries. It was a uniform institution for a very long time, until there's a schism in the church about 900 AD, where we see the development of Eastern Orthodox Christianity practiced in modern-day Russia and Greece. However, the original Christian, if you will, was the Catholic. And Catholic is just a term that means general practice of something. So if you say that's a rather, it's just a Catholic practice, I'm not referring to the faith in that term. I'm just referring to a general thing, a general practice, a generally understood practice. So that's really where that term Catholic comes from. And it wasn't until 1500 that we see the Protestant faiths of Christianity start to develop. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit here. But going back to the Muslims, remember that the Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim empire, they were rather tolerant of Christians and Jews, much more tolerant of Christians and Jews than Christians were of Jews and Muslims at that time. So these are the early faiths this is the early faith of Islam, and believed in a unity of all people, caring for their community, donating to the poor, and so on and so on. The Roman Catholic Church developed from Roman Christianity, which goes all the way back to the late days of the Roman Empire, right before it fell. And we have a period of time of about 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, from 500 to about 1500, where really the Roman Catholic Church becomes the most powerful institution in Europe. There is no longer a political institution like the Roman Empire that's running things. We now, for 1,000 years, we have a religious institution that has gained a significant amount of social, political, economic influence across Europe. And of course, it goes without saying, religious influence as well. So paganism starts to be increasingly stamped out. More and more and more people become adherents to the Roman Catholic faith, and they influenced all aspects of life. Okay, the Roman Catholic Church was a very, very, very powerful institution. And the Roman Catholic Church expected 100% obedience. There was no questioning of authority of this time. The Middle Ages is sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages. It's a period of time where the Roman Catholic Church was really trying to establish a uniform doctrine of living that would enable the upper echelons of the Roman Catholic Church to retain power and considerable amount of influence. So there was no questioning, and really the Dark Ages, the 1,000 years that the Roman Catholic Church is in charge of things, is not the brightest era of human history. Europe is rife with wars and conflict, and there's a lot of in the Roman Empire, you look at these amazing features of Roman civilization: the art, the architecture, the political structures, and all of that. There's really none of that from the Dark Ages. And you do have these towering cathedrals that get built, but we know virtually nothing about the people who built them. And the Middle Ages are an unusual, dangerous time where Europe kind of devolves into this tribalistic, chaotic mess for about 1,000 years. And during this time, there are relatively few innovations by way of art or architecture or inventions or anything like that until we get to the Renaissance. Now, unfortunately, for the purposes of this class, I don't get a whole lot of time to talk about the Middle Ages. But to be honest with you, I'm really, really fascinated by the Middle Ages, and I love studying particularly the late Middle Ages, because there's a lot of really cool stuff that comes out of the medieval era in terms of storytelling and history and so on, even though it's kind of a dark time for humanity. But unfortunately, in this class, we don't really get an opportunity to spend a whole lot of time talking about that. Essentially, I give you the background that I just did. We gloss over about 1,000 years from the fall of the Roman Empire all the way up to 1500, where we get to the Renaissance. And we pick up the story then when kind of this rebirth of ancient Greece and Rome, Roman culture starts to proliferate across in first Italy and then across France and other areas of Europe as well. So we are going to next be talking about the Renaissance. But before I move on to that, it is 8:30 right now. Are there any questions about things that I've covered from the Roman Empire or the monotheistic religions for this course or for this class? Questions, anything that I can clarify for you? Okay, well, if there's no questions, comments, concerns, here is what we're going to look at next is the Renaissance. And so the last thing that we're going to be talking about today is the Renaissance. And I didn't understand the wolf who raised the kids. Okay, so the story on that is, it's a mythical story. It's not an actual story, Jason. That's a good question. So the story goes that Rome was founded by these two brothers, Romulus and Remus. Okay, Romulus, think Rome. Okay, Romulus and Remus. And the story goes that they were raised by a she-wolf. Okay, like a woven woman. All right, and that this made them really battle-hardened and tough. Right. And so it's just an origin story for the Roman Empire. Okay, it's not something to be taken literally. The thing that makes studying ancient history really hard is that it's wrapped up in a lot of mythology. Okay, and it can be really difficult to discern fact from fiction. I really wish my lights would stop turning off. All right. So yeah, it's not like. Yeah, it's just a mythical origin story. All right, nothing to be too concerned with. Okay, so moving forward here to the Renaissance. I'm now on slide 53 of the PowerPoint. And so Renaissance was the French word for rebirth. Okay, it comes from a French term. And this Renaissance, this rebirth that we're talking about is a rebirth of the ancient Greco-Roman traditions that we've been talking about in this class. So, for so long, think about this, for 1,000 years, roughly, about 900 years, in Europe, the Roman Empire is dead. The Colosseum was this run-down ruins where homeless people lived, okay, for hundreds of years. It was in the middle of this really seedy, disgusting pit, okay, of Rome. Nowadays, you go to the Colosseum, it's beautiful, right? Even though it is still ruins today, right? The Colosseum was almost like, if you think about, like, if any of you are into Star Wars, it's almost like going to an ancient Jedi temple where there was a whole bunch of mystery of, like, what was this even used for, right? This is an ancient civilization that hadn't been around for hundreds of years. People had forgotten about it. Okay, people didn't know the story of Rome outside of the most upper educated echelons of society, maybe. Okay, but the Roman Empire and much of what Rome had and the purpose of things and the art and architecture of Rome laid in ruins. It was a decrepit, decaying mess. Okay, and so people in the Middle Ages, there wasn't a whole lot of concern about Rome. There was an active interest in erasing the history of Rome and replacing it with the dominance of the Roman Catholic Church. And so there was starting in the 1300s this revitalization, this rebirth, this renewed interest in uncovering these ancient knowledges. Okay, particularly from wealthy merchant families who lived in the Italian city-states. And remember, after the fall of Rome, Europe descends into this fragmented, chaotic mess where you have local nobles running the show. There's really not a lot of centralization anywhere in Europe for about 1,000 years. The only thing that ties everyone together is this kind of, cultural cultural stranglehold that the Roman Catholic Church has on everybody, but in terms of politics and state structures and stuff like that, everything fragments into a giant mess. And so Italy is made up of, at this time, a bunch of essentially small states: Milan, Venice, the Papal States, which is where the head of the Roman Catholic Church was. That's where modern-day Rome is situated. Naples, and so on and so forth. Genoa. Okay, so there was a number of these different small states. And the wealthiest merchant families in these states began to trade with the Ottoman Empire, which was off to the east. And the Ottoman Empire began trading kind of ancient texts, ancient sculptures, ancient art to the Italians, okay, to people from these various states of Italy. And beginning with the Renaissance, they start to kind of reject the view that people had held for 1,000 years under the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church said your life on this earth is unimportant. There's only one thing that you live this life for, and that's the afterlife. Your accomplishments here on this earth, your needs on this earth, your actions on this earth are of no consequence. The only thing that is of consequence is your afterlife. And so people lived in a particular way to live their lives for the afterlife. And that's kind of partially explains why we don't know a whole lot about all of these towering cathedrals that got built in the Middle Ages, is because they weren't building them to be recognized as individual architects or great masters of construction. They were building them to glorify God and to make it into the afterlife, which is, their main prerogative at that time. Well, starting with the Renaissance, people start to realize, wow, we've lived an awful long time with relatively few developments, living in kind of this period where there's this fragmented, chaotic mess across Europe. And it seems that in ancient times, there were actually quite amazing human achievements that were accomplished in developing societies and very complex structures. And I can tell you about various examples of that with Rome and the aqueduct system, for example, or their vast trading network that they utilized these roads. The Romans had mastered the Mediterranean Sea, which now, after the late Middle Ages, was a giant, dangerous place where pirates would rob you or whatever. I mean, trade on the Mediterranean became extremely dangerous, whereas before the Romans controlled the entire sea. All right, so people start learning, uncovering these ancient teachings, these ancient civilizations, translating stuff from Latin into their modern language. They no longer spoke Latin in Italy. People spoke Italian by this point. The language had evolved over the last 1,000 years. No one spoke Latin anymore. Even priests, a lot of times across Europe, may not have even understood the Latin that they were giving their sermons in or that the Bible was written in. Most people were illiterate by the time that we get to the late Middle Ages. People lived in these small little inbred hamlets across all of the European continent, which was very dark and dangerous and covered by forests and so on. Plagues ravaged the countryside and killed tremendous numbers of people, including the Black Plague of the late 1340s, where about a third of the European population was killed by this terrible bubonic plague and later pneumonic plague that spread across the continent. And so anyhow, the population was very, very vulnerable for a long time. They were illiterate, they were inbred, they were subject to war, they were subject to disease, they were subject to natural disaster, and had relatively no education to be able to explain what we would consider to be very easily explainable phenomena. Probably not one person in this class looks at the sun rising in the east and setting in the west and thinks to themselves, oh, gee, Earth is just this stationary object that the sun revolves around. We all know common sense, quote unquote, today dictates that you understand that the sun is situated in the middle of the solar system and all of the planets revolve around it, okay? But back in those days, there's nothing to, your eyes show you, your senses would determine, well, look at me, I'm standing still. I can't feel Earth moving, okay? I see the sun move across the sky. Of course, we're the ones that are still, and the sun is the thing that's moving around us. Okay, and for us today, we think of that idea as absolutely preposterous because we know that's not how the solar system works. Not so in those times. And to question it would have drawn suspicion on you. So to question those things that you were told by people higher up than you in the social system in Europe at this time would have made you stick out like a sore thumb. They would have thought of you as a devil worshiper or something like that, a heretic, somebody who is questioning what they've been told, which is not how society functioned while the Roman Catholic Church was in charge. So you didn't question what you were told. You were told something, and whether or not you believed it, you better act like you believed it, because if you didn't, you could be subject to some pretty crazy punishments. So starting with the Renaissance, we have this renewed interest in these ancient teachings, these ancient Greco-Roman antiquity ideas. And this renewed interest in classical Greek and Roman culture results in artists of the Renaissance developing new techniques as they began to paint and create sculptures and so on. And it doesn't happen overnight, but some of the most incredible artists that are still well known by students in modern times, like Leonardo da Vinci or Raphael or any of the Ninja Turtles. That's a joke. Anyway, so the Renaissance masters, as we sometimes call them, developed entirely new techniques to painting and sculpture that were based on some of the techniques and masters of art from the ancient Greek and Roman times. And so on the next slide, on slide 54, this is a painting. It's actually a mural. It's painted on a wall. You can actually, in the lower left-hand corner, see a doorway down there. But this mural is called The School of Athens, and it's by Raphael. And if we ask ourselves, wait a second, how come this painting was painted in the early 1500s, okay, but the subjects of it are these ancient philosophers? In the middle there, that's not Jesus, that's not God, okay, that's Plato and Aristotle. Okay, that's Plato and Aristotle in the middle there. Plato is the man on the left, Aristotle is the man on the right in the center there. Look at some of the features of the art. We've got arches, we've got white marble, okay, we've got all of these other figures sitting around who are other thinkers, ancient thinkers. These are not biblical figures, which again was a major shift in the art, because the idea with the Renaissance is you're no longer just living for the afterlife. You're living to understand your current life. You're living to respect human achievement. And the idea was still somewhat Christian-based, because they're doing it because they believe that humans are the most perfect creation of God. So there is still a little bit of a religious tie here, but the idea is that they can start focusing on non-religious, non-Christian, non-Bible story figures and focus on actual living humans who once lived on the planet and achieved great accomplishments. So some of the other people, I won't take too much time doing this, but you can actually look it up if you like. Some of the other people in this painting included Socrates, included the mathematician Pythagoras, and even if you look at the very, very, very far right, it's almost kind of like a Where's Waldo. It's kind of funny. On the very far right, there's a guy that's in white, and standing directly next to that guy in white, you only see his head. And that is actually Raphael, who has painted himself into this image as a master of the Renaissance arts. And so he puts himself in with some of these great figures as evidence of the renewed interest in human achievement, in not divine achievement, but in human achievement of becoming a great artist. And so he puts himself among some of the greatest thinkers of any time in history in this image here. Okay, so the Renaissance is all about rediscovering and studying Greek and Latin writing, art, culture, and teachings. And like I said, individualism becomes emphasized. Why would Raphael paint himself into this picture? He's trying to be recognized as a master. He's focusing on his individual achievement. Okay, he's not like, he doesn't come of the same background as people from the Middle Ages who thought that their lives were unimportant. Raphael viewed his contributions to human achievement as very important and wanted to be recognized for them, as did other Renaissance figures like Leonardo da Vinci and so on. They started to also be a little bit more critical of the way that life, government, and indeed even the Roman Catholic Church itself was run. By the time that we get to the 13, 14, and 1500s, the Roman Catholic Church has become quite a corrupt organization. There's a lot of wealth, there's a lot of power, there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of things that the higher-ups in the higher-ranking figures of the Roman Catholic Church are engaging in that is not particularly Christian in its practices. And so the Renaissance opens the door for people starting to, not right away, but starting to question authority and say, maybe we should look at trying to make some improvements to society, make some improvements to how the church is run, and so on and so on. So this is what the Renaissance kind of kicks into motion. And then from there, it progresses into something called the Reformation. And this is where we see a religious reform movement, which is critical of the Roman Catholic Church and kind of how corrupt and loosey-goosey they have gotten in terms of how they run the show. The Roman Catholic Church, as I mentioned a minute ago, was engaged in a lot of not so illustrious behaviors. They were doing some things that they shouldn't be doing. And one of the things that they're doing at this time that starts to raise concerns from lesser ranking Catholics, particularly Catholics in Northern Europe, which were situated a long way away from the reach of Rome, which is where the Roman Catholic Church was centralized or centered. These lesser ranking priests or monks begin to challenge the church in some of its practices, in particular, the sale of something called indulgences, pardons, almost like a get out of hell free card, if you think about the game Monopoly. And what it was you could buy essentially these indulgences if you were wealthy enough, and the church would collect the money for the indulgence and forgive you of your sins. And it was a way of getting people to pay money to the church. But there were some lesser priests and monks, one of them being Martin Luther, but also there were a handful of others that started to question this practice and say, this doesn't really seem like something that's written in the Bible. And I'm reading the Bible and I can't find anything about indulgences in there and so on. The Black Death had hit Europe just about 150 years earlier, and the church had really widened its ability to collect money from its believers and find excuses for ways to pay money to the church to save loved ones that perhaps died unexpectedly from the plague and other things like that. And this was seen as a corrupt practice by guys like Martin Luther and some other people that I won't list their names here, but because you're not going to be tested on them. But Martin Luther didn't just come out of nowhere. There were other predecessors to Martin Luther that inspired Martin Luther to begin criticizing the church. But it's really Martin Luther who really takes the first major break away from the Roman Catholic Church when he nails his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral in Saxony, which is in now modern-day Germany, and starts to question the practices of the Roman Catholic Church and their sale of indulgences for the purposes of collecting money so that they can commission art from some of these great Italian Renaissance painters to come in and paint frescoes. Like, for example, the Sistine Chapel, which is attached to St. Peter's Basilica, which is in the Vatican, which is in Rome. Some of the famous painting of God reaching out and the two fingers nearly touching, that's on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, and it was painted by Michelangelo. And the Roman Catholic Church, of course, had to pay Michelangelo to do this. And so the Roman Catholic Church is trying to collect as much money as they can to build new cathedrals and so on. There's a whole line of money that they're collecting from their believers to pay for really beautiful, opulent art that was extraordinarily expensive, priceless, really. And so Martin Luther, who's kind of a poorer, lesser-known monk in the far distant regions of Northern Europe, starts to criticize this opulence, this grandeur of the Roman Catholic Church as being greedy. And that's really where the beginnings of Protestantism arise. And so now Protestantism is comprised of a whole bunch of different faiths: Methodism, Baptists, non-denominational, Episcopalians, Puritans, Mennonites, Quakers, Lutherans, Presbyterians. There's all sorts of Protestant faiths, dozens and dozens and dozens of them, but they all get their start in the 1500s when they break away from the Catholic Church, with Martin Luther being the first to do so. So anyhow, that pretty much wraps up the lesson for today. I am going to be posting an assignment pertaining to what we talked about today on Schoology. On Canvas, sorry. Force of habit. I've been using Schoology for years. It's my first year using Canvas. I'll be posting this on Canvas, and so be looking out for that. I do have another class to teach in a few minutes here, so it probably won't get posted right away, but as usual, there will be a daily assignment that accompanies what we talked about in today's lecture. And so be looking out for that as we approach right around noon somewhere. Excuse me. So thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in today. If you have questions, of course. Before we leave, I have to take attendance. Why don't you pop in the, type in the, if you could, in the chat, we need to have everybody respond so I can take attendance. So if you could have any superpower, let's say you're going to become like a Marvel superhero, all right? But you can only have one superpower. What would it be? Type in your superpower. Telekinesis, invisibility, super speed, invisible. Teleportation, that'd be a good one. Flying, nice. Invisible. Really? Lots of people picking invisible. I wonder why. What would you do with invisibility? I just don't understand why that would be. I wouldn't pick invisibility. I'd pick I think telekinesis would be cool. I'd take Magneto's power, control metal. That'd be awesome. Mind reading. Ooh, dangerous there. Mind reading would be dangerous. I don't want to know what other people are thinking. Oh yeah, if your name doesn't pop up, make sure that you tell me what your name is so that I can read through these. Okay, cool, thank you.
Happy to help.
Quiet you. All right, to fly. Ooh, yeah, to fly would be fun. Telekinesis, yep. Moving things with your mind sounds pretty awesome. Be honest, you've tried it before, haven't you? I have. I just wanted to see if I had the force. Okay, I just wanted to see. Every so often it's good just to check. In case maybe it was a latent ability and you developed it somehow afterwards. But be honest, how many people have actually tried to move something with your mind, right? It's worth a shot, at least. Anyway, okay. Well, folks, we are done with class for today. I appreciate you guys tuning in. As I said, I'll put up the assignment in a little bit here, so be looking out for that. Thanks so much for responding to... thanks so much for responding to me. Hey, Keegan, shoot me an email because I feel like you should be able to get into Canvas, but I don't know if you've been able to or what. Your story is kind of an interesting one in terms of you. Okay, you're in now. All right, cool. All right, just making sure. All right, very good, folks. Well, if you have any questions, hit me up on Canvas. Send me a message on Canvas, and I'll get back to you. Other than that, be looking out for the assignment that I'll post later on today, and make sure you submit the assignments that you have not yet submitted if you have not submitted them yet. So have a great day.